Mine is really the special spot because we've never really had anything in America before quite like George Weigel. Now, there have been influential Catholics, of course, politicians, for instance, but most of them from Boston probably believed in being Irish Democrats as much as they did in being Catholic. And then there were the great builders, the founders of Catholic things, like Boston College. But except for a few figures like Orestes Brownson and Michael Novak, the really influential figures in the American church and from America over in Rome have always been clerics. There's an odd little exchange of letters between Jacques Maritain and Etienne Gilson toward the end of their careers when they complain that for all their success, no one in the church took them seriously because they didn't wear Roman collars. Now, Vatican II was supposed to change all that, and though it took a while to find the laity that it championed. But find him it did. George Weigel is exactly what the Council intended. He is the ideal of a Vatican II Catholic. At every point, he has been where he should be, out ahead of the rest of the chattering classes. In 1987, he published Tranquillitas Ordinis, and it took more than a decade for the rest of the nation to catch up and realize that great work was going on in just war theory. In 1992, he published The Final Revolution, and this time it took Newsweek and the television talk shows only 5 years to catch up to what George Weigel had told them had happened with the Vatican and Eastern Europe. Then in 1992, he published a thin little volume called Witness to Hope, his biography of John Paul the Great. And this time it took only a year or two for the rest of us to realize what George had done. Not in time to win a single Catholic Book Award that year, I'm ashamed to say, but in time for it to be recognized eventually as one of the key Catholic documents of our time. And it was done by a layman, and it was done by an American. In the years since, George has gone on to write 4 more books, most recently The Cube and the Cathedral, his account of Europe as it is and as it might be. Tonight he returns to the thought of John Paul II, and we are privileged indeed, it seems to me, to hear George Weigel on Wojtyla and the Philosophers. Ladies and gentlemen, George Weigel.
Thank you very much, Jody, for that extraordinarily generous introduction. Excesses like that always remind me of what Lyndon Baines Johnson used to say when he would get an excessively effusive introduction. He would thank the introducer and then say, "I just wish that my mammy and my daddy would have been here to hear it. My daddy would have enjoyed it, and my mammy would have believed it." So, thank you, Jody. Thank you, Jorge, for the invitation to be here. Thank you to all of you. Are we okay sound-wise? This is what we call in the television business a narrow cone here. Is that okay? That's not a description of a mitre, but of a microphone here. Karol Joseph Wojtyla was a singular man, an intellectual with a deep respect for popular piety, a mystic who was an active sportsman until well into his 70s, a celibate who wrote with great insight about human sexuality, a priest and bishop who marveled for decades at the gift of his priesthood and episcopate, and whose closest and oldest friends included laymen and women he had first met when they were university students. An orphan before he reached his 21st birthday, he nevertheless came to embody paternity for millions of people in a world bereft of fatherhood. John Paul II was the most visible man in human history, having been seen live by more people than anyone who ever lived, and some 2 billion people participated in one way or another in his funeral. Yet he had a deeply ingrained sense of privacy, and his most intense experiences were ones he couldn't describe, for they took place in a dialogue with God that was quite literally beyond words. It is not a cliché, but the simple truth of the matter to say that we shall not see his like again. His singularity extended to Karol Wojtyła's life among the philosophers. He never took an undergraduate or graduate course in philosophy. He never taught as a full-time faculty member in a department of philosophy, and never held a rank higher than docent, the lowest on the Polish academic ladder. His philosophical masterwork remained, and now will always remain, uncompleted. Yet this autodidact philosopher, who liked, as he put it, to do philosophy from the standpoint of Adam, seeing the world afresh and anew, drew the professional respect of Thomists and phenomenologists, Catholics and agnostics, classicists, medievalists, moderns, and perhaps even a few postmoderns. Wojtyła's philosophical convictions also had a profound impact on the history of our times, as the title of this conference reminds us. Solidarity, for Wojtyła, was a way of understanding authentic human being in the world before it was a banner erected in the Lenin shipyard in Gdansk. Karl Marx famously remarked that while philosophers analyzed the world, he intended to change it. Karol Wojtyła did both, and the changes he helped advance were the embodiment in history of the understandings he had achieved, as those understandings reflected the truth which had seized his life and his imagination. As I am not a professional philosopher, I can't bring a specialist's perspective to the work of this conference, but perhaps I can bring something else of use, a biographer's perspective that locates Karol Wojtyła's philosophical work within the broader context of his singular life. Before he came to the world's attention, Wojtyła had hammered out his philosophy on the anvil of his experience as a man, a priest, and a Pole, and did so at a time and in a place where the stakes were high indeed. Revisiting that time and place may help us understand something of Wojtyła's earlier experiences among the philosophers, which will then help us understand his walk among the philosophers as the Bishop of Rome. In an extended interview shortly after his election to the papacy with the French journalist André Frossard, John Paul II confessed, perhaps a little sheepishly, that his first encounter with philosophy had been an unpleasant one, if an ultimately crucial one. In 1942, Karol Wojtyła had been accepted into the clandestine seminary being run by Archbishop Adam Stefan Sapieha of Kraków. As part of their comprehensive assault on Polish intellectual and cultural life, the Nazi authorities had shut down the Archdiocesan Seminary, which Sapieha then reconstituted on a clandestine basis. Seminarians like Wojtyła continued their day jobs, in his case a night job at the Solvay chemical factory, while coming to the Archbishop's residence to serve Mass, receive spiritual direction, and get academic assignments. Books were assigned to be read, marked, and inwardly digested, with exams to follow on a future visit to Sapieha's residence. Early in this process, Wojtyła was told to read and learn Kazimierz Weiss's text, Metaphysics, a 1926 tome written in the arid formulas of one style of early 20th century neo-scholasticism. Wojtyla was flummoxed. He was a literary man. He had read widely and deeply in poetry, fiction, drama, and history. He had been writing poetry and plays since adolescence, but he had never encountered anything like Kazimierz Weiss. His later description of that experience to André Froissart is worth a quote. My literary training, centered around the humanities, had not prepared me at all for the scholastic theses and formulas with which the manual, Weiss's book, was filled. Excuse me. I had to cut a path through a thick undergrowth of concepts, analyses, and axioms without even being able to identify the ground over which I was moving. After 2 months of hacking through this vegetation, I came to a clearing, to the discovery of the deep reasons for what until then I had only lived and felt. When I passed the examination, I told my examiner that the new vision of the world, which I had acquired in my struggle with that metaphysics manual, was more valuable than the mark which I had obtained. I was not exaggerating. What intuition and sensibility had until then taught me about the world found solid confirmation. It was an important moment in Wojtyła's life among the philosophers. For all the intellectual and, I expect, aesthetic suffering he inflicted, Kazimierz Weiss gave Wojtyła an intellectual inoculation that lasted a lifetime, an inoculation against radical skepticism about the human capacity to know the truth of anything. In dungarees spattered by watery lime at that chemical factory, Wojtyła discovered what he would later call a new world of existence in the dusty propositions of Weiss's metaphysics, an intellectual universe built around the central Aristotelian Thomistic conviction that the world is, in fact, intelligible. That conviction stuck with him to the end, and it profoundly shaped his way of doing philosophy. The agonies of the war, and a life already filled with suffering and tragedy, had given young Karol Wojtyla a sharp, even harsh, experience of reality. Those nights slogging through Weiss's metaphysics in the Solvay chemical plant gave the nascent philosopher the first building blocks for what would become, if through a very different methodology than that of the neo-scholastics, a philosophical position that was proof against epistemological skepticism and its cousins, moral relativism and metaphysical boredom. After priestly ordination in 1946, 2 years of graduate study in Rome, and a few months in a rural parish, Father Karol Wojtyła's first extended assignment was at St. Florian's Church near the Florianska Gate to Krakow's Old Town. The parish was a traditional magnet for the Krakowian Catholic intelligentsia. Archbishop Sapieha sent Wojtyła there to launch a second chaplaincy to university students. At St. Florian's, Wojtyła organized study groups that read Thomas Aquinas in the original and explored basic philosophical issues of apologetics, an urgent matter in a country choking intellectually on the cultural smog of late Stalinism. Ski trips and other outings became an occasion for the young priest to get his student friends thinking philosophically. Almost a half-century later, Jerzy Janek, who later became a distinguished nuclear physicist, but who had never studied metaphysics, remembered being fascinated in the late 1940s by what he described as Father Wojtyła's way of thinking, in which one could speak coherently and in a connected way about everything, from their ski poles to God. Others, perhaps not so speculatively inclined, remember young Father Wojtyła's sermons as being rather philosophically dense, a trait from which he liberated himself after some useful criticism from his lay friends. In an environment of communist mendacity in which truth was a function of power, Wojtyła's fledgling efforts as a philosophical tutor, however dense and challenging, were received by his young parishioners and friends as a kind of intellectual liberation. That Wojtyła was not entirely satisfied, however, with the neo-scholasticism in which he had been trained was evident from the criticism his first doctoral dissertation had received from Father Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange, his dissertation director at Rome's Angelicum. Garrigou-Lagrange, the master of mid-century neo-scholasticism, was unhappy that Wojtyła, writing about the concept of faith in St. John of the Cross, did not refer to God as the divine object, and docked his grade accordingly. One assumes that this point had been discussed between director and student, and judging from the result, the conversation didn't persuade Wojtyła. He remained a Thomistic realist, but he seems to have been looking for a different method to get at the truth of things. His opportunity to do just that in a more concentrated way came when Cardinal Sapieha's successor, Archbishop Eugeniusz Baziak, ordered him to leave the student chaplaincy at St. Florian's in order to write his Habilitationsschrift, which would earn him his second doctorate in theology and qualify him to teach at the university level. Wojtyła decided to write on the German phenomenologist Max Scheler, an associate of Edmund Husserl, in the original phenomenological school that had included Roman Ingarten, Edith Stein, and Dietrich von Hildebrand. Why was Wojtyła attracted to Scheler, a mercurial character and difficult thinker, whose work he had to translate from German into Polish? Perhaps it was because of phenomenology's intention to see the world whole, and through that seeing, to arrive at a realistic analysis of things as they are. Specifically, Wojtyła wanted to see if Scheler could help Catholic philosophers provide a secure philosophical ground for Christian ethics. This attraction to a modern philosophical method like phenomenology was not, I should add, a matter of conducting a frontal assault against the neo-scholasticism he had been taught. Wojtyła had no interest in pursuing a war of attrition against the entrenched semi-official Catholic philosophical method of the time. If certain forms of neo-scholasticism were a barrier to an encounter with modern philosophy, Wojtyła simply went around them, having gratefully absorbed what seemed to him enduring about the neo-scholastic approach, its conviction that philosophy could get to the truth of things as they are. On the basis of that conviction, he was prepared to encounter other philosophical systems on their own terms, and would later recall that wrestling with the second categorical imperative of Immanuel Kant had been, as he put it, particularly important for his later thinking. That it was, in fact, wrestling was neatly illustrated one night after dinner when John Paul II rolled his eyes and groaned, "Kant, mein Gott, Kant." He said it. His experience as a pastor, a confessor, a teacher, and a writer had given Wojtyła what we might call a natural phenomenologist's intuition, which certainly helped him in his analysis of Scheler. He appreciated Scheler's personalism, which seemed to him to rescue ethics from Kantian abstraction and to restore the pathos, the tragedy, and indeed the ethos to the human condition. Wojtyla also appreciated Shaler's defense of moral intuition and his analysis of moral sentiments like empathy and sympathy, which helped break philosophy out of the prison of epistemological solipsism. Above all, Wojtyla appreciated Shaler's effort to analyze the realities of moral choosing, which struck him as a more satisfactory approach to the foundations of ethics than a formal abstract system like Kant's. But could Shaler do for contemporary Christian philosophy and theology what Aristotle had done for Aquinas? Wojtyla's basic answer was no. For Wojtyla, moral acts were real, are real, the acts of real people which have real consequences. Shaler, in his view, had not grasped how moral choices actually shape a life. So Wojtyla judged that in Shaler's ethics, morality remained somehow outside the human world. Wojtyla was also critical of Shaler's tendency to overstress the emotional aspects of experience and knowing, which he thought led to a foreshortened view of the human person. Here, as in his critique of Shaler's analysis of moral choices, Wojtyla the philosopher was influenced by his pastoral experience. He knew that the young men and women he had helped guide through their own moral difficulties were not simply composites of their various emotional states. Nonetheless, Wojtyla came away from the Shaler dissertation convinced that phenomenology was a useful, even important philosophical instrument for probing the human condition. Phenomenological inquiry had to be grounded, however, in a resolutely realistic general theory of things as they are. That was the path he intended to explore in his own future philosophical work, and the result would be what Wojtyla would later call a way of doing philosophy that synthesized both approaches: the metaphysical realism of Aristotle and Aquinas and the human sensitivity of Schalerian phenomenology. And for Wojtyla, this philosophical modus operandi was an intellectual conviction with consequences. If men and women could not know good and evil, if moral choices were only matters of personal preference, then all choices were ultimately indifferent. That, he believed, would empty human freedom of its drama and deprive men and women of their most distinctively human quality, the capacity to know the good and to freely choose it. If Wojtyla's habilitation was his first sustained effort to marry the realist objectivity he had learned from Thomism to the subjectivity of modern philosophy, it would not be his last such effort. Thus, the Shaler dissertation previewed the philosopher and theologian who would later write about love and responsibility, freedom and self-denial, democracy and a vibrant public moral culture, the free economy and solidarity. Wojtyla's instinct for synthesis was, to be sure, a sign of contradiction in the late modern and postmodern intellectual philosophical worlds, and in North Atlantic high culture in general. One might see in that instinct, however, both a Christian sensibility and a reverence for the wisdom of the past. Jesus tells his disciples after the multiplication of loaves and fishes, "Gather up the fragments that nothing may be lost." Karol Wojtyla's pastoral experience had taught him that fragments of a life could be gathered into a whole. His philosophical instinct was to reconnect fragmented human understandings. That, he believed, was the best way to account for the complexities of the human drama while remaining in conversation with the great minds who had laid the intellectual foundations of Western civilization. He was most intensely engaged in that conversation during his years of teaching at the Catholic University of Lublin, a school almost unknown outside Poland where large ideas were being explored. The Catholic University of Lublin, or KUL in its Polish acronym, was founded in 1918. Curiously, one of its midwives was Lenin, who allowed Father Iji Radziszewski to take the library of Petrograd's Polish Academy of Theology back to Poland when the priest was trying to get KUL launched. Chartered by the interwar Second Polish Republic, the university was shut down by the German occupation, with numerous professors imprisoned, tortured, or killed outright. Its state charter, however, permitted KUL to survive the imposition of Stalinism in Poland after the war. And the Catholic University of Lublin became the only Catholic university behind the Iron Curtain, a distinction it maintained throughout the Cold War. As one of its senior scholars put it to me, the Catholic University of Lublin during the Cold War was the only place between Berlin and Seoul where philosophy was free. Its faculty and students pursued the academic life in a situation of constant confrontation, sometimes cool, sometimes hot, with the communist regime. Between 1953 and 1956, the faculties of law, social science, and education were shut down. Even after the political thaw of 1956, the student population was kept artificially low. Lublin graduates found it difficult to obtain academic positions elsewhere, and the faculty had trouble publishing their work. These pressures helped turn the Catholic University of Lublin into a university with a vocation. At a time when many influential figures in European intellectual life were flirting with Marxism, and sometimes more than flirting, KUL defended the unique dignity of the human person against an aggressive ideological opponent, while demonstrating that Catholic faith and human reason were allies, not enemies, in the mission of reconstituting Western humanism. In allowing the Catholic University of Lublin to function, the Polish communist regime may have imagined the school as little more than an intellectual petting zoo. They had no idea that something new could happen in such a medieval place. According to Professor Stefan Swiejowski, KUL to the regime was the Catholic equivalent, Swiejowski told me, of a Hasidic ghetto. The authorities may also have thought that they were creating another opening for penetrating the Catholic Church through planted agents among the students. The faculty and student body, especially the university's faculty of philosophy, had very different ideas about what they were doing. The Lublin Faculty of Philosophy was established in 1946 in response to the great hunger for philosophy evident throughout Polish intellectual life. The war and the Nazi attempt to decapitate Polish culture had created a distinctive intellectual situation in Poland. In the immediate post-war period, philosophy lectures at Krakow's reopened Jagiellonian University were delivered to overflow audiences. In Lublin, lectures in metaphysics were standing room only, with students sitting on the floors, in the aisles, and on the windowsills of the lecture hall. There, they heard different members of the philosophy faculty explore the philosophical issues posed by the hard experiences of the immediate past and present, life under Nazi occupation and life in Stalinist Poland. Everyone who had lived through the brutalities of the occupation and the imposition of communism had confronted the ancient philosophical question, what is a human being, in urgent, unavoidable ways. Why had some people acted like beasts while others had shown remarkable heroism? Why were some people grotesquely self-serving to the point of betraying their friends, while others were nobly self-sacrificing, laying down their lives for others they may have known only slightly. The only way to get at these problems, the cool philosophers agreed, was through a deepening of philosophical anthropology. What is human nature, and how are we to understand its dynamics? How is that curious blend of matter and spirit, the human person, constituted? How are we to explain the difference in kind between human beings and other sentient creatures? What, if anything, is the point or goal of life? These hardy perennials in the garden of philosophical inquiry took on an especially sharp edge at Lublin in the late 1940s and the early 1950s. Convinced that a crisis in modernity's understanding of the human person lay at the root of the 20th century's distress, the Lublin philosophers of the late 1940s began to sketch out an ambitious philosophical initiative in which metaphysics and anthropology would meet in ethics. As a subdiscipline of philosophy, ethics may once have been a handmaiden to other grander specialties, but the Lublin philosophers believed that the problem of ethics posed itself in a particularly urgent way because of the political situation. Communism was not only a matter of bad metaphysics, with its reductionist account of things as they are, and bad anthropology, with its caricature of humanism. Communism's totalitarian politics stripped men and women of their power of choice, of responsibility, and thus of their humanity. The counter to both communist materialism and communist politics, the Lublin philosophers thought, was a more complete humanism that gave a more compelling account of human moral intuitions and human moral action. In proposing to do this without falling into the quicksand of thinking about thinking about thinking, the Lublin philosophers set themselves no small task. Indeed, it involved nothing less than challenging the entire direction of philosophy since the Enlightenment. Moreover, it was a project with a distinctive edge, for the Lublin philosophers proposed to fight the great political philosophical battle on Marxism's own ground, the question of the true liberation of the human person. The Lublin project was defined by a quartet of relatively young men who, in a nice piece of irony, had become professors at Lublin because Poland's Stalinist rulers had expelled the older teachers. The four included Jerzy Kalinowski, the dean of the faculty, a logician and philosopher of law, Stefan Swiatkowski, whom I've mentioned, a historian of philosophy and a follower of Jacques Maritain and Etienne Gilson, Father Mieczysław Albert Krampietz, a Dominican specialist in metaphysics, and Father Karol Wojtyla. This quartet was subsequently amplified by Fathers Marian Kordziałek, who specialized in ancient philosophy, and Stanisław Kamiński, a specialist in epistemology. The Lublin philosophers were different personalities with divergent interests and academic specialties. They nonetheless achieved what Professor Swiatkowski later called a rare and exceptionally fruitful collaboration built around four agreements which were crucial to Karol Wojtyła's philosophical project. They began with an ancient conviction. They would be radically realistic about the world and the human capacity to know it. If our thinking and choosing lacks a tether to reality, the Lublin philosophers believed, raw force takes over the world and truth becomes a function of power, not an expression of things as they are. A communist-era joke in Poland expressed this realist philosophical imperative in a way that everyone could grasp. As the joke went, the party boss asks, "How much is 2 plus 2?" And the Polish worker responds, "How much would you like it to be?" the political meaning of the realist assumption of the Lublin philosophers was, of course, later expressed in a famous Solidarity election poster in 1989 that read, "For Poland to be Poland, 2 + 2 must always equal 4. Human beings can only be free in the truth, and the measure of truth is reality." The Lublin philosophers also agreed on a modern starting point for philosophical inquiry. They would begin with a disciplined reflection on the human person and on human experience rather than with cosmology. The stakes were high here. If philosophy could get to the truth of things as they are through an analysis of human experience, then the path to a reconciliation between Catholic philosophy and the scientific method could be opened, while concurrently modernity would be pulled loose from the quicksand pits of thinking about thinking about thinking. Adopting this starting point was also crucial in the confrontation with Marxism. There, the serious questions did not involve who understood physics better, but certain very basic issues. What is the human vocation? How do we build history? Is history best understood in material and political terms, or does history have a transcendent dimension? The Lublin philosophers also shared, in the third place, a profound commitment to reason. Others may have had the cultural, economic, and political freedom to speculate about the alleged absurdity of life. The Lublin philosophers, veterans of the cultural resistance against Nazism, had no such luxury. They had seen the films of Hitler's Nuremberg rallies. They had been subjected to more than 5 years of Nazi propaganda. They had lived through a brutal occupation. They knew what irrationalism could do if it got loose in history with sufficient material force. But the Lublin philosophers' commitment to the method of reason was coupled with a determination to illuminate the good and the human capacity to know and choose the good so that men and women might, in fact, choose the good. Finally, the Lublin philosophers agreed to practice an ecumenism of time. If they refused to be imprisoned inside their own consciousness, they also declined to be slaves to contemporaneity. They believed that the history of philosophy had things to teach the present, that the past had not been made completely disposable by modernity. These were men whose vocational conviction that ideas are not intellectuals' toys had been amply confirmed by hard experience. Ideas had consequences for good and for ill. Defective understandings of the human person, human community, and human destiny were responsible for mountains of corpses and oceans of blood in the first half of the 20th century. If philosophy could help the world get a firmer purchase on the truth of the human condition in a way that was both distinctively modern and grounded in the great philosophical tradition of the West, the future might be different. The Lublin philosophers were a community of personal and intellectual friendship, and that great rarity in academic life, a genuine team. Once he had been granted a faculty position at Lublin in 1954, Karol Wojtyla commuted overnight from Krakow to Lublin every 2 weeks. And on virtually every one of those trips over the next 7 years, Wojtyla and his colleagues met as a group to talk through the common project in which they were engaged. Although Kalinowski, as dean, was the initiator of their conversations, this was a gathering of equals, who, as John Paul II later recalled, found it a great advantage to learn from each other's distinctive perspective and current work. At the same time, there were real arguments and intellectual differences among the Lublin philosophers, some of whom, like Father Krumpietz, had combative personalities. Imagine that, a combative Dominican. Karol Wojtyla's continuing interest in phenomenology and his ongoing investigation of modern and contemporary philosophy raised eyebrows among some of his more traditional colleagues, as did his philosophical and professorial style. He had a generally unfootnoted way of doing philosophy. He did philosophy like a peasant, his premier student later told me, and he was far more concerned with mapping the terrain of things as they are than with providing an extensive academic apparatus of citations and cross-references for every proposal or assertion. Father Wojtyla was also singularly free of that professorial gravitas usually associated with senior academics in European universities. To say that the Lublin philosophical faculty had its disagreements and in some respects its rivalries is simply to say that it was a faculty of men, not angels. The important thing about the Lublin philosophers was the boldness of their intention. They conceived their project in part as a response to the peculiar circumstances of their time and place, and in part as a response to the general cultural conditions of the mid-20th century. The range of its reach and its capacity to shed light on the human condition in very different situations would only come into focus when Professor Dr. Karol Wojtyla, by then working under a different name, took the most adventurous part of the Lublin project to an audience whose numbers vastly exceeded the readership of Polish philosophical journals. Karol Wojtyla succeeded to the chair of ethics at Lublin in 1957 and remained an active faculty member of the university until his election to the papacy in 1978. Indeed, during his first months as pope, he continued to serve as a reader of Lublin doctoral dissertations, and he retained the chair of ethics at Lublin for some years before ceding it to his protege and friend, Father Tadeusz Stichin. Wojtyła's most intense involvement at Lublin took place between 1954 and 1961, when his pastoral responsibilities in Krakow made it impossible for him to commute to Lublin any longer. For the next 17 years, between 61 and 78, his doctoral seminar came to Krakow for two-day work periods at the Archbishop's residence. From 1954 to 1961, and in addition to teaching the basic undergraduate ethics course and directing his doctoral students, Wojtyła gave a series of graduate lectures. The 1954-55 lectures on Act and Experience explored the philosophical ethics of Scheler, Kant, and Aquinas. The 55-56 lectures were on the subject Goodness and Value, and involved an extensive dialogue with Plato, Aristotle, Augustine, Aquinas, Kant, and Scheler. Perhaps anticipating a set of problems that would emerge in a post-communist world, Wojtyła dedicated his 56-57 lectures to Hume and Bentham under the rubric Norm and Happiness. His 57-58 and 58-59 lectures focused on sexual ethics and eventually led to his first book, Love and Responsibility. In 1960-61, Wojtyła gave his last graduate lectures at Lublin on the theory and methodology of ethics. One might hope that these monographic lectures, as they're known in Poland, might someday be available in English. It would be fascinating to enter into Wojtyła's dialogue with philosophical ethicists representing a wide range of methods and judgments. From 1962, when he was elected Vicar Capitular of Krakow on the death of Archbishop Baziak, until his translation to Rome in 1978, Karol Wojtyła's energies were increasingly absorbed by pastoral responsibilities in Krakow and by his expanding role in the world church. He did what he could to continue his walk among the philosophers, directing his doctoral seminar from and in his residence in Krakow's Old Town, where he also hosted evening philosophical seminars where a wide variety of philosophical schools were represented. As circumstances rarely permitted, he lectured abroad, including a well-received visit to the Harvard Summer School in 1969. His intervention at the International Thomistic Congress in Fossa Nuova in 1974 so impressed Joseph Pieper that the venerable German philosopher immediately got in touch with Professor Joseph Ratzinger at Regensburg, urging him to read Wojtyła's work. Moreover, it was during this period of intense pastoral activity that Wojtyła attempted his philosophical masterwork, Osoba I Czyn, Person and Act. I say attempted because Person and Act is very much part of the unfinished symphony of Karol Wojtyła's philosophical project. He never produced a revised and completed version in Polish, although a third edition edited by his principal students and collaborators is available in Polish. The extant translations in other European languages are of varying quality. The currently available English translation is not trustworthy, for it bends the entire work in a direction that does not do justice to the author's intent to maintain the tension between subjectivity, person, and objectivity, act, that was a hallmark of his thinking. All of that being said, however, Person and Act is the closest thing we have, and now ever will have, to a full statement of Wojtyła's mature philosophical position. So a brief review of its origins and key themes may be helpful in filling out this biographical portrait. The origins of Person and Act are unclear. In an unpublished memoir of his work as a philosopher, which he gave me while I was preparing Witness to Hope, John Paul II remembered that a Krakowian priest, Monsignor Stanisław Czartoryski, had told him after the publication of Love and Responsibility, "Now you must write a book on the person." Later, in that same unpublished memoir, the Pope points us in a slightly different direction, writing that he wanted to work out in much greater detail the issues involved in marrying an Aristotelian Thomistic philosophy of being to a Schillerian philosophy of consciousness. Wojtyła's leading philosophical disciple, Father Stitchin, gave me a third explanation of the origins of Person and Act. The book was intended, Stitchin told me, to move philosophy from the Cartesian cogito ergo sum, which had eventually led philosophy into the prison of solipsism, to cognosco ergo sum. I understand, therefore I am a human person. Which move, Stitchin believed, would reconnect thinking about thinking, or philosophy's turn to the subject, to the things that were to be thought and understood. Father Stitchin, I should note, was a disciple with edge. When Wojtyła showed him the manuscript of Person and Act and asked for his comments, Stitchin replied, "It's an interesting first draft. Perhaps it could now be translated from Polish into Polish to make it easier for the reader, including me." This perhaps explains a joke among two generations of Krakowian clergy who all said that the punishment for misbehaving clergy in purgatory would be to read Osoba I Czyn. Person and Act is also a product of the Second Vatican Council, and in two senses. The first sense is personal. Not even so assiduous a listener as Karol Wojtyła could sit quietly in the council aula listening to gusts of Latin rhetoric day after day, month after month, over 4 years. 30 years after the council, John Paul II would admit to me, perhaps a little sheepishly, "You know, I wrote many parts of books and poems during the sessions of the council." Thus, Person and Act gave Wojtyla a connected piece of intellectual work to do amidst the fragmentation of conciliar debate. It also gave him the opportunity, for which the time was evidently right, to pull together the threads of exploration in his monographic lectures into a single philosophical tapestry. There is another deeper way in which Person and Act is connected to Vatican II, however. The Council had affirmed that the human person, precisely as a person, has a right to religious freedom, and that the right of religious freedom exists so that we may freely seek the truth, including the ultimate truth, who is God in his self-revelation. Wojtyla thought that this teaching had to be given a more secure philosophical demonstration by showing that man's search for meaning is directed toward the good, and that the man who seeks the good wants to seek what is objectively good. The subjectivity of the person, which expresses itself in our freedom, is ordered by its own internal dynamics to the question of what is in reality good, which is also what is in reality true. Wojtyla also believed that the personalism of Gaudium et Spes, Vatican II's pastoral constitution on the church in the modern world, that too had to be put on a more secure philosophical base. For here, as he told Father Henri de Lubac, the great debate of late modernity was being played out. As Wojtyla wrote to de Lubac in 1969, the evil of our times consists in the first place in a kind of degradation, indeed in a pulverization of the fundamental uniqueness of each human person. This evil is even much more of the metaphysical order than of the moral order. Against this disintegration, we must propose a kind of recapitulation of the inviolable mystery of the person. That is what Person and Act was intended to do. The book begins with an introduction in which Wojtyla reflects on human experience and how human beings know the world and the truth of things. He then tries to show how our thinking about the world and ourselves helps us to understand ourselves precisely as persons. Some things simply happen to me, but I have other experiences in which I know that I am making a decision and acting out that decision. In those experiences, I come to know myself as a person, a subject, or in the classical term, the efficient cause of my actions. Some things don't simply happen to me. I am the subject, not merely the object of actions. I make things happen because I think through a decision and then freely act on it. Therefore, I am somebody, not simply something. Wojtyla then tries to show how in moral action that somebody begins to experience his or her own transcendence. Our personhood, he argues, is constituted by the fact of our freedom, which we come to know through truly human acts. In choosing one act, to pay a debt I have freely contracted, rather than another, to cheat on my debt, I am not simply responding to external conditions, fear of jail, or internal pressures, guilt. I am freely choosing what is good. In that free choosing, I am also binding myself to what I know is true and good. We can discern the transcendence of the human person in this free choice of the good and the true, Wojtyla suggests. I go beyond myself, I grow as a person by realizing my freedom and conforming it to the good and the true. Freedom, on one modern reading of it, is radical autonomy. I am a self because my will is the primary reference point for my choosing. Wojtyla disagrees. Self-mastery, not self-assertion, is the index of a truly human freedom, he argues. And I achieve self-mastery not by repressing or suppressing what is natural to me, but by thoughtfully and freely channeling those natural instincts of mind and body into actions that deepen my humanity because they conform to things as they are. Empiricists try to find the human center in the body or its processes. Kantian idealists try to find it in structures of consciousness. Wojtyla, in a sense, leapfrogs the argument between empiricists and idealists by trying to demonstrate how moral action, not the psyche or the body, is where we find the center of the human person, the core of our humanity. For it is in moral action that the mind, the spirit, and the body come into the unity of a person. That person lives in a world with many other persons. So, Person and Act concludes with an analysis of moral action in conjunction with all those others who constitute the moral field in which our humanity realizes itself and transcends itself or grows. Here, philosophical anthropology touches the border of social ethics. How should free persons live together? As might be expected, Wojtyla takes a position beyond individualism and collectivism. Radical individualism is an inadequate anthropology because we only grow into our humanity through interaction with others. Collectivism strips the person of freedom and thus of his or her personhood. Once again, Wojtyla suggests the issue is best posed in both and terms, the individual and the common good. In working out his theory of participation, Wojtyla analyzes four attitudes towards life, as he styles them, towards life and society. Two are incapable of nurturing a genuinely human society. Conformism, as he describes it, is inauthentic because it means abandoning freedom. Others take me over so completely that myself is lost in the process. Non-involvement is inauthentic because it is solipsistic. Cutting myself off from others eventually results in the implosion of myself. Opposition, or what might be called resistance, can be an authentic approach to life and society if it involves resistance to unjust customs or laws in order to liberate the full humanity of others. Then there is solidarity, the primary authentic attitude towards society, in which individual freedom is deployed to serve the common good, and the community sustains and supports individuals as they grow into a truly human maturity. It is this attitude, Wojtyla writes, that allows man to find the fulfillment of himself in complementing others. He could not have known, of course, when he first wrote about it in Person and Act, that solidarity would become the rallying cry which dramatically changed the history of the 20th century. As far as circumstances permitted, Karol Wojtyla continued to walk among the philosophers after his election as Pope. He hosted biennial humanities seminars during the summers at Castel Gandolfo, at which distinguished philosophers were always present. The cast of characters and the themes were predominantly continental European, flavored on several occasions by the Canadian Charles Taylor. He kept himself informed of developments at Lublin, where his former department colleague, Father Krampietz, now the rector, found a way around the communist regime's academic regulations to name Wojtyla honorary professor, a title he held until April 2nd of last year. From a distance, he encouraged the work of a second successor generation of Polish philosophers, including Father Andrzej Szostak and Dr. Wojciech Hudy, whose habilitation thesis, Philosophy in the Trap of Reflection, John Paul II once called the most important book in our school since Stefan Swiatkowski's History of Being. What leisure time he allowed himself as Pope was often filled by reading contemporary philosophy. He was particularly interested in the philosophers of dialogue and was likely the only man in the world who read Emmanuel Levinas for fun. As Pope, Wojtyla signaled his ongoing concern about contemporary culture's emphasis on instrumental reason in his first encyclical, Redemptor Hominis. He continued to develop that theme in the 1991 encyclical, Centesimus Annus, in his reflections on the foundational cultural requisites of the free and virtuous society. 7 years later, in September 1998, John Paul II issued Fides et Ratio, the high point of his magisterial reflection on the importance of philosophy in itself, the importance of philosophy for the church and theology, and the importance of philosophy for human culture. The encyclical was the first major papal statement on the relationship between faith and reason in almost 120 years. In 1870, the First Vatican Council had taught that human beings could know God's existence through reason. Leo XIII's 1879 encyclical Aeterni Patris had proposed the philosophy and theology of Thomas Aquinas as the model for a synthesis of faith and reason. But a lot had happened in the world since the penultimate decade of the 19th century. Not least, philosophy's drastically diminished confidence in its capacity to know the truth of anything with certainty. In Fides et Ratio, John Paul called this philosophy's false modesty and suggested that it had precluded philosophy from probing the big questions. Why is there something rather than nothing? What is good and what is evil? What is happiness and what is delusion? What awaits me after this life? Philosophy's true vocation was to be a servant of the truth. The contemporary discipline's false modesty demeaned that vocation and helped open the door to a culture dominated by other forms of hubris, an instrumental view of other human beings, a false faith in technology, the triumph of the will to power, whose lethal effects had made the 20th century into an abattoir. It was past time, John Paul argued, for philosophy to recover the sense of awe and wonder that directs it to transcendent truth. The alternative, wrote this man who truly believed that ideas had consequences, would be yet another century of tears. Philosophy ordered to transcendent truth also remained crucial for religious believers, John Paul wrote. Ancient Greek philosophy had helped purge religion of superstition. The temptation to superstition is perennial, though, and sometimes takes the form of the claim that faith is not subject to rational analysis, which in contemporary culture means stressing faith as a matter of feeling and experience. Citing Augustine, John Paul flatly rejected such fideism. Quote, "Believing is nothing other than to think with assent. Believers are also thinkers. In believing they think, and in thinking they believe. If faith does not think, it is nothing." In a 21st century destined to be heavily influenced by resurgent religious faith, this call to a reasonable faith looms large. To postmodern theorists willing to allow religion a place at the table of intellectual life, because religious truth is one possible truth among others, Fides et Ratio says, in effect, no thank you. Unless thinking is open to what John Paul terms the horizon of the ultimate, it will ultimately turn in on itself, it will inevitably turn in on itself, and be locked in the prison of solipsism. The synthesis of Greek philosophy and Christian theology in the patristic period taught a wiser lesson. Human beings can know the true, the good, and the beautiful even if we can never know them completely. Recovering that sense of confidence, John Paul asserted, is essential to creating a genuine humanism in the third millennium. The path to a wiser, nobler, more humane future thus runs through the wisdom of the first centuries of encounter between Jerusalem and Athens. The separations of faith and reason, science and religion, philosophy and theology over the past several centuries had been caused by both philosophers and theologians, John Paul suggested. When theologians demean reason and philosophers deny the possibility of revelation, both are diminished, humanity is impoverished, and the development of a genuine humanism is frustrated. Faith and reason, John Paul wrote, are like two wings on which the human spirit rises to the contemplation of truth. And we can be sure that we will need to fly with both wings in the millennium ahead. The quest for truth is an instinct built into us. And the grandeur of the human person, the Pope concluded, is that we can choose to enter the truth, to make a home under the shade of wisdom and dwell there. That Fides et Ratio was issued amidst the celebrations of John Paul II's 20th anniversary as Pope was entirely appropriate. In 1978, Karol Wojtyla had begun his pontificate with the clarion call, "Be not afraid." 20 years later, John Paul II continued to preach courage in Fides et Ratio. Be not afraid of reason, the encyclical proposed. Be not afraid of the truth, for the truth, dispelling delusions, will set humanity free in the deepest meaning of liberation. The Pope of freedom, the Pope of a new humanism, had remained faithful to a vision of human possibility and civilizational transformation, which had been deepened by his 50-year-long walk among the philosophers. Confounding the expectations of skeptics and enemies, he had made the Catholic Church the world's premier institutional defender of human reason. Voltaire must have been spinning in his grave. Karol Wojtyla's philosophical project will be assessed by professional philosophers for centuries. All those who admire intellectual courage will remain impressed by his effort to bridge the gap that had been opened in the 17th century between the world we want to grasp and the intellectual processes through which we think about that world. Yet it should be emphasized that philosophy, however seriously he took it, and he took it very seriously indeed, was never an end in itself for Wojtyla. Wojtyla's walk among the philosophers was an integral part of his life as priest and bishop. Leaving the professional assessment of his philosophical accomplishment to his philosophical peers, perhaps I can close with a biographer's appreciation of the large ideas that Wojtyla's philosophical work put into play in early 21st century culture. His first achievement was to demonstrate that what he called in 1974 a law of the gift was, as he put it, inscribed deep within the dynamic structure of the person. Which is to say that the threshold of hope, as he styled his international bestseller, was not so much ahead of us as above us in the dramatic struggle to surrender the persons we are to the persons we are called to be. That struggle can only be resolved by self-giving. It cannot be resolved by self-absorption or by radical personal autonomy. Wojtyla's demonstration and explication of this law of the gift can be engaged by anyone willing to work through a philosophical argument. Those who take the time and trouble to do so will discover a concept of goodness with traction, one that does not collapse into a mere social construct. Wojtyła's second achievement was a function of his extraordinarily wide range of interests, which did not, alas, extend to baseball, but which encompassed just about everything else. Wojtyła took his literary training and theatrical experience and married them to rigorous philosophical analysis in order to produce a picture of human life as inherently or structurally dramatic. We are not adrift, he insisted, in a cosmos without meaning. We are not the accidents of galactic biochemistry, nor is human history a byproduct of the exhaust fumes generated by the means of production. As moral actors, we can become the protagonists, not the objects or victims, of the drama of life. Wojtyła's demonstration of these truths of the human condition had immense appeal to those living under totalitarian repression and led to new forms of political resistance. His demonstration of those truths should also be attractive to those oppressed by a sense of powerlessness rooted in nihilism. Then there was utilitarianism. I think it's instructive that Wojtyła was dissecting Bentham in 1956 and 57, when Bentham could hardly have been a major figure in Polish intellectual circles. Somehow, Wojtyła had intuited that the Western humanistic project faced dangers beyond and after communism. So over the years, Wojtyła's walk among the philosophers gave rise to his deep-reaching critique of a modern culture in which others are too often measured by their financial, social, political, or sexual utility. And he took that critique in a positive direction by his exploration of the claim that our relationship to truth, goodness, and beauty is the true stuff of our humanity. In doing so, Wojtyła showed that accepting the moral truth involved in the law of the gift is not a limit on our freedom or creativity. Rather, truth makes us free and enables us to live our freedom toward its goal, which is happiness. Rocco Buttiglione, an insightful commentator on Karol Wojtyła's walk among the philosophers, once suggested that there was what he called a hidden theological tendency in Wojtyła's philosophical personalism. In person and act, Wojtyła's method was strictly philosophical, but the inspiration was Christian. It is in God the Holy Trinity, a community of self-giving persons who lose nothing of their uniqueness in their radical self-giving and receptivity, that we see confirmed the law of the gift and the truth about freedom as freedom for self-donation. Thus, Wojtyła's philosophy, like every other aspect of his life, was touched by his ongoing dialogue with God in prayer. And that, too, may have something to say to contemporary philosophers. Writing in Die Welt in 1982, the Yugoslav dissident Milovan Djilas remembered that even after the assassination attempt that came within a few millimeters of ending his life, John Paul II seemed a man utterly without fear. Why was that? Djilas asked. Father Tadeusz Styczyn suggested an answer to me, recalling John Paul's response to a question from André Frossard. The French journalist had asked the Pope what the most important word in the gospel was. Truth, John Paul immediately said, for Christ had been born to bear witness to the truth, which was not a truth for Christians, but the truth of the world. Secure in that truth, and having deepened his understanding of the dynamics of the human apprehension of truth by his walk with the philosophers, Karol Wojtyła could be a man without fear and could summon others to fearlessness. Here was a philosophical walk with consequences. Thank you.